should banks continue to actually finance projects with fossil fuel?
Banks, the approach that we're taking is to promote a just transition. So we made a commitment to net zero. We will be communicating to our shareholders in the outside world shortly what our plan is. We have every confidence that we can do that, and we think that we have a central role to play in helping our clients, in particular in emerging markets, Asia, Middle East, and Africa, to bridge their enormous financing gap to affect their own transition. But it must be just. And if we're asking emerging markets countries to write big checks at the expense of their citizens at a time when they're trying to recover from the pandemic, now fine, we can say 3 years from now that won't be the case, but they will have other problems at the time. While they're waiting for the $100 billion to come from the G20 governments, which maybe we're going to have a breakthrough in Glasgow in a few weeks' time. It hasn't come so far since the last time.
Do you think we will?
I hope so.
Okay.
And I think there's a resolve. I don't know if there's a checkbook, but I do think there's a resolve. But the way to convince the developing world that they've got to go along is to say, well, no, look, you don't have a choice, right? And whether it's your financiers or the people who are buying your products, they're going to insist that you have a transition plan. We're here to help you with that transition plan, but we're not going to do that in a way that completely snuffs your growth opportunity at a time when growth is essential for your own citizens, right? So that whole idea of a just transition means a fair transition for these economies. Now, in that context, is there a role for fossil fuels today? Yeah, I'm afraid there is. Coal needs to be phased out quickly. That's the dirtiest fuel. We've got very clear policies about, we will do no new coal financings, either coal-fired power plants or coal production or anything like that. We've got to have a transition plan that gets us out of the business of funding new developments and other fossil fuels. But we're going to be dependent on fossil fuels for the next 15 or 20 years, unless there's some miraculous technology breakthrough. And it's critical for a fair transition in our economy. So phasing it down to zero by 2050, roughly 50% reduction by 2030. That's what we'll do as a bank, and that's what the market, that's what the world needs to do. But we can't have simple edicts like no more fossil fuels. It's just not practical.
But it means that then we won't be able to reach our temperature targets.
We will reach the temperature. If everybody transitions to net zero by 2050 with a 45 to 50% reduction by 2030,
it'll work.
We'll get there.
And the credits, you think, are a good way?
First and foremost, everybody must reduce their own business model, the manufacturing process, to the greatest possible extent. Right? We can't give people an excuse not to do the right thing for their own business. But honestly, I think the pressure coming from everybody, the pressure from our shareholders, from the people who finance us or the people who we finance, the pressure from supply chains to reduce your own manufacturing activities in line with the science-based targets, that pressure is inexorable and I don't think will be resistible.
Okay.
But there will be some emissions that are impossible to abate or very difficult to abate. And we must encourage companies to get that last, whatever it is, 10, 15%, 20% maybe. Take the money. You can't reduce any further yourself. Give it to somebody, invest in somebody, transfer it to somebody who can get that carbon out of the environment through a carbon credit market. But let's do it transparently. Let's do it with scale. Let's do it with high confidence that when you've bought that credit, you know that the world thinks that's a good thing to do. And the most frustrating thing to me is that people still associate the carbon offset market with greenwashing.
Right. I was going to ask you about greenwashing.
Yeah. And there's a good reason. Right. And when you look over the past 30 years, or 20 years, I've been in this market one way or another for the past 20 years. There are plenty of examples of deals that were either turned out to be greenwashing or were always going to be greenwashing. It's not the majority of what happened, but there was plenty of that there. This task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, which I've had the great privilege of chairing for the past year, has been focusing on setting very high standards, like unquestionably high standards, to make sure that there's high confidence that if you have a core carbon principle, which is what we've labeled the standard that we've established, if you've got a transaction that's consistent with the core carbon principles, it's a good transaction, and you are reducing the ultimate carbon in the environment. We put a board of directors in place, advised by an expert consultation panel that will be also advised from a different perspective by a senior advisory council, dominated by independents. So the majority of this board is people who don't have a connection to the carbon market or buyers or sellers of credits. They're not emitters. These are people that are there as custodians for the planet. They have no incentive to compromise on the high integrity standards that we set. So once you set that standard, if you transact a credit in that market, you are improving the environmental situation.
Okay. Is it much more complicated that you think that you would have thought it would be at this point to actually? So if you have, for example, a plant and it's ESG, but you're destroying biodiversity by building a renewable plant? Like, how do you make that decision?
Yeah, so there's two ways that we've tackled that. One of the criteria for our core carbon principles is that we do no harm. So
Right.
if you're doing harm to local communities, indigenous people, to biodiversity,
Right.
it's not going to qualify as a contract under our core carbon principle. That's the sort of the defensive approach. The offensive approach is to say what we want to do is create a market, and we are doing that right now, which says, yeah, this is the carbon standard that we set. But there's also, you may have additional attributes that are valuable to you. So local employment, protection of water resources, not do no harm, but actually do some good.
Yeah.
You may want to pay extra for that contract. So when we talk to the people who are really big in the climate investment game, many of them happen to be oil companies or other large airlines. I mean, they're very advanced in their thinking on this. They're investing directly in projects to protect rainforest, but almost always with a secondary objective as well. Promote local employment, to protect biodiversity, protect natural carbon sinks that also protect biodiversity. And they'll pay more for that because it's important to them in their business model. We want to make sure that we also capture that into the transparent market to help just get that virtuous circle where there's a sense that you're doing something good, but it's also by being transparent, you're getting the scale and the acceptability.
Okay.
That means we can do more.
Are we transparent enough?
Right now, no. Right now, the vast majority of what happens effectively in the climate
finance,
offset space is over the counter and undisclosed. So we're trying to urge everybody to come forth, put the trades out onto a platform. So I think one of the things Senator Chartered has done is together with partners in Singapore, we've created something called Climate Impact X. And in fact, we've got our first auction of high integrity carbon projects that's coming out right now. 12 projects, all nature based. For the most part in Southeast Asia, maybe all in Southeast Asia. And we wanted to create some noise around this and say, we want to be transparent. So it's an auction. We're going to publish the price. And hopefully that will bring more people into the market.
Bill, final question. When do you think will be the day where actually banks say, I am not financing fossil fuel anymore?
Well, it depends on what you mean by not financing fossil fuel. So I think the day that banks are completely disengaged from the fossil fuel industry will be the day that there's no more fossil fuels. But if you look at the International Energy Agency or Science-Based Target Initiative or people who have really studied this carefully, in 2050, we're still going to be producing oil and gas. Coal is more debatable, but we're definitely going to be producing oil and gas. But
no new wells? Nothing new?
Well, maybe new wells, but what we'll also have by then, and this is embedded in the science, is technology which is scalable and economic to take the carbon out of the environment.
Right.
Whether it's carbon capture or storage or development of green hydrogen technologies, things of that nature. But that's so out of the fossil fuel industry, I don't know. When can we stand up and say we are highly confident that we are on a science-based target to zero emissions consistent with the Paris Agreement, which should do our part to save the planet, like in the next couple of weeks?